really a great pleasure now to continue our meeting with 2 hours of a scientific session, in a sense. Again, on this idea of archaeology for the community, but going a little bit more with which media, new medias we are using to communicate, exchange things at different levels, into our professional community, but also to outside. And it's, I think, the best place to talk about this kind of things because there are very innovative researches, processes, and people here on this aspect. So we have several presentations and discussion. And now we'll begin with Julian Richards from the ADS, and something around reporting and disseminating fieldwork to multiple audiences, traditional methods made digital.
Okay, thanks very much, Kyle. Thanks for coming back promptly after coffee. So we've been joined by several colleagues from the Centre for Digital Heritage and the ADS here in York, many of whom will also be joining us on the walking buffet later, so there'll be a chance to chat further to them about the work that we're doing in York. We're also filming and recording this session, so if you want to ask questions, just be aware that they are going to be on the record on the NEARCH website in due course. So we've put together a programme on 5 speakers, 4 internal, and then we're very pleased to be joined by Lorna Richardson to give our keynote from the University College London, from the Institute of Archaeology, so she's going to be going last. And we're each going to speak only for about 15 minutes. We might allow Lorna a little bit longer, but we want to preserve time for discussion, and also obviously want to make sure that you get off timely to your bit, so we'll be fairly brief and fast-paced to keep you awake at this late stage in the day as well. So I'm actually kicking off, and I'm continuing really a discussion that started, I think, in Oxford, where one of the things that came up was grey literature communication and the problem of the grey literature, which is common, I think, in all European countries. It's not always called grey literature, but it's the unpublished fieldwork reports, a lot of which arises from professional excavations, but in the UK also arises from community archaeology work, because as you may be aware, there's a lot of interest in archaeology in the UK, a lot of community work, and that is one of the sectors that really does not get publicised, does not get into the public domain. So I wanted particularly to address that in my presentation. The ADS has been making grey literature available for many years now, collecting it. And it's one of our best used resources. It sort of grows incrementally at about 200 reports a month, and there's currently over 28,000 of these unpublished fieldwork reports now available and searchable from the ADS. I'm sure by January it'll be up to 30,000. And these are searchable by a standard sort of, not a brilliant interface at the moment, we're working on developing it, but basically it's a sort of standard library type catalogue, but with an addition that you can search on where and what and when. So I'm not going to do a live demo, but here we've typed in Ribchester into the where Ribchester, I happen to know, is a Roman site in Lancashire. And I get a series of 10 reports back, all of which are conventionally unpublished, so they're described as grey, but all of which are now freely available online for anyone to download and read. And these reports get a lot of interest from the local community who are interested in what's found in their area, and also for people going on holiday and sort of planning trips and wanting to know, well, is there any heritage in their area? So you can click on a link to get access to the actual report. We've also, this is part of the making the grey literature white, is that each has what's known as a digital object identifier, which is you'll be aware that a lot of the problems with the stuff on the internet is that it moves and goes missing and you get the broken link. The DOI, we work with the British Library on this, and DataSite, which is a national grouping. So this is a unique identifier that means even if the web page changes, that you will always be able to type that into your web browser and find that report. So in fact, I think grey literature is in fact now completely the wrong word for this, which is hence my title, Turning the Grey Literature White, because it's actually far more accessible to the general public than reports that are published in an academic journal, which is only available in a conventional academic library, or even worse, by having to visit a county planning office, which is where most of this grey literature lives, and consult them and find it in a filing cabinet, and they may even won't charge you to consult it. So all this is now freely available to the general public. And you can download then the actual report. This is just a random selected one of these reports from Rochester, which most of this is being done by contract archaeology. This is one by Oxford Archaeology North, who did an excavation there, and you can read what they found. As well as that sort of conventional library type search, we also provide a map-based search, so that you could go to our map page, draw a rectangle around Rochester and pull up all the reports to do with Rochester in that way, or indeed any area of the country. And there you get a listing of reports there. And again, you can click to the browser and list the individual reports and click on them and download the text. So, who is actually using this? We've done a number of surveys on users of ADS. This is in terms of the broad constituencies. A high proportion, particularly, is from sort of contract archaeology and national and local government. So about 30% from contract archaeology. A high proportion as well from education, but that's a very broad category which runs obviously right from primary right the way through to higher education. But a significant number, 9%, class themselves as independent, which tends to be what a lot of the community archaeology groups class themselves as. And note, this is a sort of controversial area, particularly in the European context, but 5% of the users are actually metal detectorists, who are particularly interested in what archaeology has found. But in the UK, as I think we discussed before, the position is that this is public information, that taxpayers have as much right as everyone else to this information. And we have laws to protect the site if they are doing illegal metal detecting. But the majority of the people using this are responsible detectorists who are then reporting what they find. And when we ask them what they're using the data for, again, a large proportion is academic research, 40%, but nearly 20% here is private research, which is again reflects this sort of community public usage of these resources. 17% general interest, so maybe people planning holidays and so forth. Interestingly, 1% is actually family history. There's a huge interest in genealogy in this country, and we suspect that what happens is people having tracked where their ancestors lived, they want to know more about what that place was like at a particular time, so they then come to ADS to find out what was known about that place in the past. We have a national system in the UK, and by national it is actually remarkably national in that now England, Scotland, Wales recently, and also Northern Ireland, which are each different countries, are all now signed up to using this system called OASIS, which is, if you do a piece of field work in the UK, this is an online system that ADS runs, but you are if you're doing the work as part of commercial archaeology, in the brief for that, you will generally be required to report your field work using an online form, the OASIS form, and to upload your grey literature report via that form. And then that gets disseminated in a data warehouse to the local planning authorities. It goes to the respective national monuments records in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, so they have a copy. And then when it's signed off and validated, it's released by ADS as part of this grey literature library. So the majority of those 28,000 reports have come via this route. Now that's fair enough in terms of where there's a legal requirement as part of the specification for work. But one of the problems has been getting community archaeologists to use this, because they're usually doing work outside that development control sector. It's all their own research projects. And so at the moment we're working on a project where we're trying to encourage these community groups to use OASIS much more, and we're going to be developing the form to do this. And hot off the press, as we only got the results of this survey last Friday, we've worked with the CBA, who have good connections with community archaeology groups, and they've been surveying those groups and finding out whether they use OASIS and how they disseminate the results of their research. And I thought that this graph would be of interest in the context of today. So this is just take from this survey, only got to us last Friday, and it's sort of how, if you're a community group and you write a report about your work, how do you make that available more widely? Pleasantly surprised that actually about a third of them do make it available via ADS and Great Literature Library. But it's interesting, the largest fraction there, over 40%, is just by email on request. So you have to know that that work's gone on and email them and ask for a copy. Over 10% by post on request, less than 10% in person. Quite a high proportion might also make it available by the HEO, that's the Historic Environment Record, or the Planning Office, or other means. So we have some work to do there with community groups, but it's quite interesting that they are, and the response to the survey was that they would very much like to use OASIS. Many of them didn't know about it, so we need to work with them and communicate more to them about it. I was talking to some people about this earlier, and I just thought I'd put this slide in, so I think it is relevant. We recently did a survey on or someone else actually did the survey, not us, but an economist at Victoria University in Australia, and Neil Beagrie, who's a digital preservation specialist, did an economic impact study of the ADS and the sort of economic value of making this, particularly grey literature actually, available online, and the economic benefit to the country of doing that. These economic impact surveys are often done when you have a new infrastructure project, such as a road or a railway. So, for example, I love this analogy, that we've recently agreed to build a high-speed railway, High Speed 2, from London up the west side of the country, based on an economic impact study, where there will be £2 benefit from every £1 spent on the railway. Whereas the results of the survey was that making grey literature freely available online for everyone to use leads to an economic benefit of £8.30 over 30 years for every pound invested. So we're far better value than building railways. So I'll end off my talk on that note. Sort of quite conventional literature, but thinking about new ways of disseminating it. What we're going to do is, rather than take questions after each one, unless there are any really pressing ones, we'll run on through the presentations and then take discussion at the end. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Judith Winters, who's editor of our eJournal Internet Archaeology, who's going to be talking about multiple forms of dissemination, new digital forms of publication.
Hello everybody. My name is Judith Winters. I'm the editor of Internet Archaeology, which is an electronic journal based here at the University of New York. We've been publishing digitally since 1996. The journal is an academic journal, peer-reviewed, and has recently become fully open access. I've actually been with Internet Archaeology since 1998, so I've got quite a long view of the digital span, the time span of digital publishing. So in terms of the NEARCH project, this is my to-do list. In other words, really to investigate that sort of multi-level, layered approach to presenting and disseminating archaeological information. I should say I'm doing this as part of the ADS family. So that's hence my involvement in my talking to you today. So I've got 15 minutes to get serious. So how do you get serious? You need a PowerPoint, don't you? So,
That's a good start.
But what I thought I would do first was really just to look a little bit at some of the questions that sort of to pull back the focus a little bit and think about some of the questions about why we're actually bothering to do this, why we're trying to reach out to new audiences. And I told you it was serious with the TV cats, didn't I? So the heritage features an awful lot in television programmes, and it does represent a fact that there is a broad appetite for archaeological information, as Julian has intimated. And we're being asked to consider these issues in our mandates, funding mandates, and those demands for content to be available and open access. And so we place that emphasis on that sort of societal impact of research. And really we're doing this because culture, past and present, is a very important thing. I think it was Hans Rosling, the Swedish statistician, who had a great quote in one of his TED Talks that said, culture is what brings joy to life, it's the value of living. So that idea of heritage being that universal wealth, I think, is really important. I mean, there's no doubt that really it's very difficult to find the right word to express those kind of sentiments, but I think for a society at large there is that intrinsic value to heritage and the cultural past, and it seems that people do care. And so this creates that parallel need really for better signposting to information that we're providing. And providing that information at a level that's appropriate to the audience. It's not the panacea, but it will help, removing those barriers will help that participation. And we want people to be inspired by archaeology and by heritage, and by engaging that audience is an important thing. But one thing's for certain, if the public are funding these activities, they of course need, and they're paying them through taxes, of course we need to be able to access that results. And I don't just mean by open access in this point, but I mean that ease of access, the usability of a resource, and the technological accessibility. And I think those are all crucial elements to consider. Back to the cat again. Certainly, the audience for archaeological research has changed. Once upon a time, we used to really write for academics, by academics, for academics in our electronic or in our publications. But certainly from what we can see in the access stats for Internet Archaeology, and as Julian has suggested in some of the surveys that the ADS has carried out, that there's definitely an audience beyond the profession that we're already reaching, and who are consuming the information that we're disseminating. So that engagement is already happening, even if we're not necessarily always aware of it. And I think this is an area that certainly I know Lorna, who will be speaking later, is something that she's interested in too. Also, our audiences are not all, our audiences aren't all in one place either online. They're accessing information from all over the place, from websites, from Facebook, from Twitter, from online forums. And this also raises accessibility issues too for what we're producing, ensuring that content works on all of those different platforms, as well as enabling that content to be more easily shared, to be consumed, to be reused, to be reinterpreted, because that's where our users already are. In terms of incentives, perhaps disincentives, perhaps the optimists among us might hope that this enforced exposure will force academics to write in a more accessible, interesting and engaging way, and that they'll become mindful of their wider public. We can hope. Maybe optimists always presume too much. But seriously, there are a few incentives and maybe more disincentives for people to make their work of interest to a general audience in terms of that academic credit that still exists. And it's not easy work. It does open up our work to challenging interpretations, to criticism, to misuse even, and distortion. But we ought to find ways to do that extension work and applies our expertise to that broader audience. And I'll return to that point again in a moment. But I should say there is a lot of interest from people, from academics, to reach out to disseminate their work more broadly, but there are just no easy outlets to facilitate this. And so I think that's one area where the NEARCH project is really going to point a way forward in terms of the work that I'm planning on doing. But of course, there are also those who think that none of this is necessary. So encouraging that culture change is also going to be part of that. And as I suggested, I don't underestimate how long it may take for that culture change to occur. It's taken an awful lot longer than we might have imagined back in 1996 for Internet Archaeology to be accepted as a publication in its own right, but it was somewhere where it was a dumping ground, and that reputable archaeologists didn't publish on the internet. I think we've overcome that challenge, but I think there's still quite a lot more to consider. So digital publication just allows us to weave all of these different strands of dissemination together. It's not necessarily going to change how academics write overnight, but it will allow us to adopt that integral, multi-layered approach. But clear signposting is the thing that I think is going to be needed, and it's one of my main roles, I think, to be working with authors to suggest and adapt and amend and enhance those different routes. The journal has experimented and indeed cemented in some cases our approach to a range of different publishing formats, some which engage some audiences more than others, but together they're greater than the sum of their parts. So for example, our articles are always split up into segments, into chunks. It was originally employed back in 1996 as a way to encourage, to aid the loading speed of websites, because you could sometimes wait minutes, sometimes even longer than minutes for just a single image to download. But we've kept that segmentation as a feature of articles because it does also aid things like web usability and the navigation and the accessibility of content. So articles are not published as a single PDF file to download, and of course that's not possible for some of the multimedia content that we're creating and producing anyway. But you can point out, but you can jump around from different sections quite easily from within the document. So one thing we're thinking of doing within the realms of this project is extending this by adding or overlaying summary sections or segments to existing content, perhaps targeting non-specialist or school audience, and synthesizing, and even translations, in fact, as well, could be a part of this too. And certainly we thought of this initially as just being the unit of focus would be the article, but in actual fact, there are lots of articles that are thematically linked. So I think we could possibly do this for articles across a theme as well. And that speaks to various points within the project of employing those larger narratives. Another route is really linking publications and archives. Although everything that the journal has published is called an article, some articles are essentially monograph in length, and they actually contain, as we see here, they contain links through to underlying data. This was actually based on a PhD, but it's got an underlying searchable data set that is part of the publication. And what we're doing here, and certainly with other examples, is that we're linking through to the data, whether that's within Internet Archaeology or whether it's within the ADS, the related archive that's deposited with the ADS. We're drilling down through that data and deliberately blurring the boundary between what is the publication and what is the article. And indeed, we can link to other, and have linked to other external resources as well, such as Portable Antiquities Scheme Research at British Museum. One other format I'd like to talk about specifically are data papers. And this is speaking directly to the point on enhancing access and encouraging reuse of archaeological data. Data papers are something that's gaining traction in the archaeological community. There's credit, obviously, in publishing in archaeology journals, but the level of recognition that comes with depositing and curating and maintaining a digital archive does not get the same academic kudos currently. So at the moment that's more limited. So what we've devised is a way of enabling a related journal article, short-term article, about the data archive, but published within the journal, and that the two are, again, linked. So this is just really extending that integrated model that I was just showing you earlier. So in this case, this happens to be Julian's data paper on Buriedale. There's a link there under Worked Bone and Antler, and this links through to basically the Grey Literature, in many ways, the Grey Literature report within the deposit that's made within the ADS, but also links through to the archive level at a higher level as well. And what we're interested in is developing this for some of the other exemplars that we might want to work for the project too. Obviously, integration of multimedia and video is something that we can also, that is embedded and is currently also used, and something that I would really like to see a little bit more of, because video is certainly something that engages a much younger audience. And so that's something that I think we can definitely ought to consider very seriously, especially as people move from device to device. But I think virtual reality plays a role here. This is a screenshot from a model, a virtual model of the Guild Chapel down in Stratford-on-Avon. It was made in Unity, but in actual fact the authors have embedded 3 different interpretations of how the wall paintings within this chapel may have looked within the chapel, all as part of the Internet Archaeology publication. So multiple interpretations within the model is another way that another route that we can try and explore. And one other thing that we've experimented with are author and reader comments on articles. Most of the time this works, but we find that when it works well, it needs seeding from the author. It needs the author to be a bit more proactive once the article is published to actually generate any response from the readers. But this is something that I think has definitely got roots to expand, or has definitely got potential to expand. And what I'm thinking currently is that it's probably time to take this forward. This is our own system, but what I'd really like to see is to link in with those other platforms like Facebook and Twitter that people are already using anyway, as a way of just integrating that. And again, just as I said earlier, trying to share that content. And there may be other technologies coming along that may disrupt either that infrastructure or indeed our attitudes. But we have to still think carefully about what does this mean for the journal's reputation, for the fact that we're an established peer-reviewed journal. How does this affect or match that reader expectation of what a publication is? So these are interesting questions that we're faced with now. And finally, really, we've got lots of ideas about what to do both with existing content and encouraging new content within the confines of the project. But in terms of specific, one confirmed example is going to be authored by Professor Mark Edmonds on his work based on Neolithic polished stone axes. The publication is actually, or his project is part of a much larger Leverkusen-funded project. But he specifically wishes to engage collectors of these artifacts, but also school children, as well as archaeologists and people interested in the lithic and the technologies, the Stone Age technologies. And he has been collecting audio interviews. We're looking at incorporating and including videos, but also as a series of linked and layered questions and answers that audience can choose which route they want to follow through the publication. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking for. I really welcome your input and maybe some of your questions and maybe even a challenge or two at the end. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Judith, for introducing us to some of the things then that we're going to be doing, particularly the exemplar publication that we're going to be doing under NEARCH. But I think if any of the partners here are interested in sort of exploring some of those novel forms of publication that Judith talked about, either she or I will be happy to talk to you about doing that, and we can talk to Kanjanju about how you can charge that to the NEARCH project. So we're going to be moving on now from novel forms of publication, well, still dissemination of publication, but talking about mobile apps, which of course is another particular work package within NEARCH. And it's going to be a sort of double-header, introduced briefly by my colleague Micheal Charno, who's one of our applications developers at ADS, who's going to be talking about the mobile app work within NEARCH. And then he's going to be handing over to Colleen Morgan, who's based in the Department of Archaeology here as a research fellow with EUROTAST, which is a European project about slavery. And she's going to be talking about, well, not technology in general, but her role is in terms of dissemination of the very controversial area on slavery, so there's a lot of experience in that area. But Micheal first.
Thanks, Julian. So, following on from kind of Judith's discussion of dissemination and how we disseminate archaeological data, I'm just going to give a brief update on our plans within the NEARCH project for mobile apps, which I've kind of discussed openly in Gothenburg, if anyone was there, and we haven't quite got to any development work yet, so they're all still a twinkle in my eye at this point, but we've got a good plan laid out for what we want to do. So basically, from our first kind of foray into mobile app development, which was the Archaeology Britain app, we learned a few things that were very important for us in terms of what we want to do with any future apps, or with this app in particular. And the 5 things were simplicity, sustainability, having focus, having modular, and reusability. And so those things are kind of the key things that we're trying to focus on in this project within NEARCH. So in the first instance, simplicity, we want very, very basic interfaces on it. We don't want a lot of buttons, we don't want lots of options, we just want people to engage, users to engage with the app and with the data in as simple a way as possible. And this may mean that we've dumbed it down a bit, but I think it's more useful if we do it this way, because I think ultimately the user will find it more interesting and more useful. We could also add more later, more complexity into the interface, but from the outset we're going to start with a very basic thing. Sorry, I don't know how I did that. Sustainability, with regards to data, I think anything we do in the ADS needs to be sustainable. So anything we develop, we want to make sure it's reusable in a useful way. With regards to data, we want to make sure that the data that we're putting into this app isn't siloed in this app, isn't something that's only usable within the context of the app. We want to make sure it's something that can be used elsewhere or in other contexts. But likewise, because of the nature of the NEARCH project, we want to make sure it's reusable by other project partners and other people speaking other languages. So that'll be a key component of this as well. We want to keep it focused, and in the first instance, we're going to focus on mapping and providing dots on map, basically, for how the app will actually look. I'll get a bit more in a second about what that actually means, but we think this follows on from that simplicity objective of keeping things basic and keeping things focused. I think ultimately the usefulness of the app is improved. There's a lot of apps out there that have very, very complex and very, very disparate functions, and I personally don't like them. I think there's a lot of people with opinions out there that they're not as useful as a basic, simple app. We also want to make sure things are modular. We don't want this app to be, like I said, a silo standalone. We want to make sure that we can add stuff onto it later. If other partners want to take this and adapt it, we want to make sure they can do that. So in terms of our ultimate design plans, we're going to try to keep things extensible down the road. And then finally, we want to make sure that the scaffolding we build is reusable, even within the context of the app. There's a few different plans that we have in terms of how we want the map and the dots on the map to work. One you see there is a clustering of sorts, where you have something like a city or a landscape that has a series of records associated with it, and that can be filtered, that can be queried, interrogated. But then we also want to make sure this app can support another type of interaction, which would be more of a path or a journey through a landscape or an area. Something like train journeys, or there's one of our projects, England's Rock Art, has something called Rock Art Rambles, and those are paths through landscapes that allow people to discover rock art and stuff like that. So within the context of the app, we want to make sure that we can do both of these things. And likewise, for partners who want to develop their own apps on the back of this, if they have data that's more suitable towards a clustering style, I want to make sure that they can do that easily, or if there's a more of a path-based data, they can do that as well. So the two types that I said, the cluster and the path, The cluster type data will mostly be coming from the historic environment records that Julian mentioned earlier. These are local governments that have records for their areas based on the historic environment. Those are everything from portable finds to monuments to records of events that have happened. And that can be done at the city, county, or country level. I think in the first instance we've talked about doing a City of York one, so people visiting York or people in York could use the app to discover what type of historic or archaeological information or data has been recorded around them. But we could extend that out to larger landscapes as well, out to the county or country. There's a few considerations that we have to be aware of, but it's certainly something we can easily do. The other one, the path. This becomes a bit more difficult, I think, because with the cluster model, we just dump all the data in there and that's it. We can do, but with this path one, we have to have it lightly curated in the sense that someone has to sit there and say, this is what's important and this is what should be included in this app. So that becomes a bit more work. So basically, very quickly, the overall system that will look, we're going to have all the data on app. So that little database icon that's what that's implying. We don't want to have any interactions with our servers or any remote data sources at all. The 3G coverage or the mobile coverage in this country isn't great, even in the cities sometimes. So we want to ensure that people using it don't have to have access to the internet. And then there will be certain updates so we can push out to those devices remotely or dynamically. So when people have internet access, they can get that stuff very easily. In the future enhancements, what we'd like to do, much of this model is very much a one-way street. So that the app and our development has the data on there, and that gets pushed out to the user. They have no interaction. The next thing that we'd like to do going forward would be make it more of a two-way street. Allow users to save favorites, save records, create a portfolio or a collection of information that they can then manage when they get back to an office or home to really do that kind of stuff. But I think we're going to focus on first getting a very simple, basic application out there, and then throw it out and see what people say, see if people get excited about it, or if they don't care about it, or if they want more, and then go from there. And that's it for me. And now Colleen's going to value the potential.
Thank you. Now I'm going to present something completely different, and sadly, not as Julian said, I will not be presenting much on the slavery project as of yet. I'm presenting mostly previous work. Ooh. Let me do that one. No. Oh dear.
I'm going to have to just drag it.
Yeah. Right. It wouldn't be technology without a little bit of hiccup. So while much of digital archaeology is indeed created to present archaeological information to the public, very little of it is critically constructed or theoretically informed. In my thesis and the subsequent World Archaeology article, I asked, how is a politically informed, theoretically informed piece of interpreted digital media created? Taking a cue from Conkey and Giroux's 1997 suggestions regarding how to do feminist archaeology, and Joyce and Tringham's point that women and disempowered groups have been among those specially benefiting from potential democratization represented by a decentralized medium, I suggested 4 points on how to do emancipatory digital archaeology. All right. The first point draws directly from Conkey and Giroux's prescriptions on calling for an increased visibility of researcher agency and knowledge production and absolute attention to authorship. As a creator or co-creator or remediator of digital archaeological objects, it's important to fully disclose not only interpretive decisions, but to understand the creation of these objects as reflexive action ripe with authorial intent. Digital media allows for the inclusion of multiple perspectives, and Conkey and Giroux's second point, a less hierarchical organization. On its surface, inclusion in the process of digital media object creation does not seem to be a difficult task. However, much of the work is done away from the excavation, far away from the trowel's edge. It's not changing. Yes, it is.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. There needs to be a serious evaluation of sharing, openness, and transparency associated with each project, agreed upon by all members of the project. If archaeological information cannot be shared, it should be for a stated and definite reason. Finally, careful attention needs to be paid to the multiple contexts that digital objects inhabit and the affordances and accommodations that arise with creating objects in this network of meaning. Each of these points bears expanding, but it is also important to note that they are used consciously, explicitly, and in concert with one another. Within this previously given framework, I'm here to do something a little different, to encourage you to play, experiment, and really push digital technology. So, over the years, digital engagement has become really formulaic. Take one Twitter, two Facebook, add Flickr, and blogging, and stir. Report your stats back to your funding agencies. I've done it for 8 archaeological projects, almost 10 years now, 2 major archaeological associations, and an open access collaborative blog. To give you some idea, at last count, 25 sites, not including sort of the satellite maintenance like Twitter and Facebook and all the other things feeding into this. So today I'm going to highlight several of the projects that I've been involved with over the years that disrupt this normal trajectory, that engage with the affordances of digital media. There's a large body of theory for media studies, visual anthropology, and digital materiality, and of course community archaeology that I'm going to kind of bracket here, and we're just going to take a fairly wild run through their possibilities. Yeah, that's just some of the sites that I've been involved with over the years. I'll be going, a rough order: technical difficulty, expense, and feasibility. So I've presented visual materials in more traditional ways, and these range between sort of more and less collaborative. Some things like, great. This was a video that I made on Afghanistan and archaeology, what archaeologists do. I actually don't have any pictures of it for whatever reason, but it was advertised in the New York Times. And so, in some ways, this is very didactic. This is, creating a video of us archaeologists telling what archaeologists do. We didn't really ask anyone like the questions you'd like to know about archaeologists. We kind of just fed on what we'd already heard over the years. And some of these other ones, all the way to a collaborative sort of ethnographic video I made at Çatalhöyük. I can't show this in many places because it was actually, she asked me not to, because she was afraid that people in her village would complain and see it on the internet. This is a photo show that I did in Divan, a very impoverished place in Jordan. And we had several community youth members come along and take their own pictures and give their own impressions as a digital accompaniment to this physical show. But there's very little internet access, there's very little anything there, so you really had to bring the digital down to the level. And that's also really important, finding the audience, understanding your communication, understanding your engagement, and putting your dissemination at that level. So these things are kind of within respectful remediation. This is Bolter and Grusen's idea of remediation, in which other media are represented in digital form without apparent irony, critique, manipulation, or challenge in the mediation. It is what we consider as very traditional narratives in archaeology. So the remediated form enhances the authority and the authenticity of the original. So radical and revolutionary remediation is a strategy claimed by artists and performers who seek to critique and improve on other media in the process of remediation. So this is a very normal thing happening now. It's kind of rephotography, photoshopping old scenes and new scenes together using the same viewpoint. It's really normal. People are doing it everywhere, but it's really important to people who actually live there. They're quite engaged by these very, very simple, very easy photoshops. This is some light writing that we do. I work also at Zubara in Qatar, and you can do this with a long exposure camera, so You can annotate sites, you can redraw them. This is actually a fairly loose and easy interpretation of the Zubara Fort. That's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This is a GIF that doesn't matter, it doesn't work in a PDF, but it shows single context archaeology. But this is just not possible in a more respectful remediation. Interestingly, some of my most popular things are comics, or photo comics, and it's very easy software. It's fantastic because you can make them, children can make them, and it really makes you put the archaeology into a narrative. You have to take a picture before, during, and after the excavation, and it's actually quite valuable. Then virtual reality and 3D reconstructions. Quite popular in archaeology. I'm picking on myself here. These are really boring SketchUp models that I made for Zubara. Also quite good. They love to put them on signposts, really animate things for them. But they're set pieces, made as illustrations, and they're not particularly interactive or conducive for community co-construction. They're almost like a postcard, really. So, on the other hand, we've done a lot of our community building in virtual reality in places that you can collaborate on building things. And this requires you to go out into sort of the wild, wild world of the internet and to an online world, in this case a Second Life, where users build and maintain the virtual landscape. So from 2007 till 2011, our Châteaubriand in Second Life, we hosted this virtual reconstruction. The simulation included reconstructions of current excavations, past and present lifeways at the site, a virtual museum, and hosted several forums and 4 open days. It was a heavily lived-in reconstruction. And this is so different from sort of the one-off pieces that you get. We changed the whole thing, half 100 times. We made it snow. We burnt it down. It was fantastic. Unfortunately, it's also kind of expensive. So our funding ran out, and there goes Châteaubriand. But it was an incredibly fertile proving ground for rethinking our assumptions about archaeological interpretation and outreach. I'll just breeze by this. We, over the 4 years that Châteaubriand and Second Life ran, we did all of these things. We'd come back sometimes after field work, being away from the internet for 3 months, and they'd be filled with trash or strange things, like somebody came along and actually recreated a goddess figurine, and we put a little offering right there in front of it as well, which I thought was quite interesting. So it's good to think with. It was kind of a tool instead of a final product. We recently had a Minecraft session where we built a star car in Minecraft. It's an entirely different sandbox world. You don't quite have the nuance. It's quite like a Lego. If you don't have an 8-year-old child, it is this video game where you simply place and break blocks. And so we invited children, actually, to people in general, but it was mostly children that came, to recreate the Mesolithic structures of Star Car. We said, there's only post holes left. Can you help us understand how these structures might have looked? So we had a wide range of interpretations of Mesolithic architecture. Some of them maybe not true to form exactly, but it was fascinating to see that how the kids navigated this environment that they were quite familiar with. They were more familiar with than we were. We also had paper craft. This is a torch. And we also had them compare the virtual tools of Minecraft with the tools of archaeology. You can't quite see it here, but there's a real pickaxe. There's a piece of flint there, and they were fascinated by just the analog representations of this digital thing. Right. I'm not sure who this. So this is our mixed reality, augmented reality interface of play, and we are moving in towards this direction because I am finding more and more often that bringing together analog and digital actually gives you the best of both worlds. And you're really able to create local community impact, but also broadcast it out and see what kind of happens to the archaeological interpretation on the way. So this is my main research at the moment, and we're trying really hard to use augmented reality to haunt the future with the past. This is through the Heritage and Play group at York. We've been experimenting with different mixed reality devices like Google Glass and Oculus Rift, and trying to understand the affordances of the technology in respect to interpretation and community archaeology. We also did a thing for the Heritage Jam, which brought together a whole bunch of heritage practitioners to get together and really try to, we had technology people, we had more heritage people, we had museums people, and we all came together to try to solve a problem and came up with different things. Our project won, it made me really happy, and produced a project called Voices Recognition, which is an app designed to augment one's interaction with York Cemetery. And it gives a voice in invisible features that represent the primary reason for the cemetery's existence, which is the accommodations of the bodies buried underground. It's incredibly hard to actually show this project on a PowerPoint because it's mostly auditory. It is an app that you can follow the cemetery on a screen, and then, but as you walk through it, you hear voices, and it's not just one voice coming at you, but from tombstone to tombstone. It's a cacophony of voices. It's everyone trying to tell you all the stories at the same time. And you can you zoom in onto one tombstone, and then one voice raises above the rest and tells you their story based on a interpretation of their birth, their open records that they have in their tombstone, all the information we can actually get from them. And so they tell you a brief story, and then you can move away from them. The really interesting thing about this project is most bodies at York Cemetery are actually buried in big open spaces, because those are kind of paupers' graves, right? And you don't really know that. You walk through a beautiful landscape, but with this augmented reality, augmented sensory information, when you walk across that empty grassy field, you hear a big swelling of voices. It's an interesting project. It's a little creepy, actually. But this is just one potential for this kind of technology in archaeology. So to sum up, digital archaeology should not isolate community members with technology. It should be interactive and expansive and use technology as an augmentation to reality rather than a single lens filtering the experience in place. The value in this is the potential to create a greater sense of community, belonging, and awareness of landscape. So the emphasis is to play in the world of the community, using their tools, using visual modes they understand, Minecraft, Second Life, whatever, no matter how blocky. But at the same time, we're interjecting, we're interfering with the public's understanding of the past, we're changing it, surprise, enlighten, destroy preconceptions when necessary, rebuild a better, stronger, more curious, and more passionate interest in what we do. As archaeologists, we must use digital media to highlight inequity, to bring the voices of stakeholders into relief, to decenter interpretations, and to make things and share them. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thanks, Colleen, especially for challenging us, as always, new ways of using digital technologies to communicate heritage. We're now going to move on to how we might use digital technologies to help communities record heritage. And Gareth Beale is the research fellow in the Centre for Digital Heritage here in York, and also director of the Basing House Technology and Community Engagement or Community Recording Project.
Thanks, Julian. So I'm going to talk to you about a few different projects today, and they're all community projects which I co-direct with Micheal Beale, who's also based at the Centre for Digital Heritage here. And I didn't completely with one place. You've got that as well. These projects all involve the use of technology as a form of engagement with
you can stand up as well.
Oh, okay. All right. I'll just sit here. No, I won't get it. So all of these projects use technology in different ways to engage with different audiences. And one of the things which I think is most interesting to do when we talk about projects like this is to add a bit of nuance to who we're talking about when we talk about the public or different communities. And so I'm going to talk to you about 3 projects today which involve different communities who I hope have benefited from learning about digital technology and through learning about digital technologies and heritage, actually that enabling them to participate them in the construction of archaeological knowledge or history, heritage knowledge, whatever you want to call it. And that's going to happen through these projects in several different ways. So I don't want to precede that with too much explanation, but I'll go through it as we go. And as Julian said, these projects will all focus on documentation, but then also the creative reuse and reappropriation of archaeological data. So the first project I want to talk to you about today is in some ways the most conventional of these projects as a community outreach and archaeology project. The goal of the Rereading the British Memorial project is to train local history groups, of which we have many, probably thousands in the UK, to use low-cost digital documentation tools such as reflectance transformation imaging, which some of you might have come across, but also photogrammetry and even low-cost survey to help them to document heritage sites which are of particular interest to them, with a focus on churchyards, graveyards and other sites of memorialisation, which are a common feature of the European human environment, really. I was going to say urban environment, but it can go down to the tiniest village, and those are often the places that we end up working. One of the really interesting things about this project has been the extent to which the agenda of the project has been driven by the communities that we work with, and the extent to which each community has their own set of priorities and has their own agenda. So we're aware of the fact that we're inserting ourselves into a pre-existing community of people, and that in a sense is the power of the project, because communities can have this enormous sense of inertia behind them, so there's real drive in a certain direction. And as an academic walking into that environment with this technology, it's never a neutral experience. You're always having to be very sensitive. And so the development of each sort of cell of the project, so the development of the project within each community context is always unique. And it's a highly reflexive experience, developing a unique methodology in dialogue with a specific community. Now, to be very candid with all of you, the challenge that emerges from working with communities in this way is that it can be then very difficult to try to extract coherent data from all of these communities, which can then be viewed side by side, if that's your goal. And it was one of the goals that we started out with. To use the enthusiasm of local communities to document churchyards and graveyards, and then to make that archive available to everybody. But there is a challenge there which we're now facing, and that's an exciting part of this project, but it is a challenging part, and I think that that's something worth bearing in mind in all projects which involve digital technology in any community, be it public, research, or whatever. And then moving away from now the typical public engagement project, I'm going to go into a slightly less typical project here, which is an archaeology project, and it was initially primarily set up as a means of training undergraduate students in archaeological fieldwork within a really fairly extreme, actually, research archaeology context. So this is Basing House is a 15th century house, a grand house in Hampshire in southern England, near to Basingstoke, and it was destroyed during the English Civil War, which was one of many 17th century religious wars taking place during that period across Europe. And the site was subsequently reappropriated by landowners and turned into a romantic ruin, and all of these things that are very common to European experience. And what we were interested in doing on this project was engaging a really diverse, actually, research community, and as Colleen was saying before, trying to create a less hierarchical approach and to actually use the skills of our participants to their greatest effect. The participants included undergraduate students, as I've said. There's a tendency to lump them together as one entity, but in fact they all have different skills, different attitudes, and different things to offer. But then we also worked with the Basingstoke Archaeological and Historical Society, who are a local history and archaeology group, many of whom had entire careers before they even came to voluntary archaeology. One example being a metal detectorist whose career had been in scientific imaging and photography, and so trying to train him to do any kind of digitization was a really enlightening experience, because you'd tell him how to set up a camera and he'd just sort of and just take you aside afterwards and give you a lesson in photography, so that was fantastic. And then also working with art schools, and this was the genesis of the next project I'll talk about, which has now begun to wind down, or is at least finding new form. So we worked with art schools on this project to try to develop new methodological approaches towards archaeological visualization. So visualization, as you all know, within archaeology, as in any academic discipline, has a tendency to become formalized quite quickly. So the way in which we draw archaeological plans, for example, the way in which we take archaeological photographs, and these kinds of things have found a form, a distinct form within archaeology, which can be challenged, but it certainly exists. And we were really interested as we started to introduce new visualization technologies, so three-dimensional computational photography, things like laser scanning, the production of 3D data that way, and all of these digital documentation techniques, even down to surveying, which isn't as new, but it still, I think, has yet to find the full potential of expression that can be achieved there. And to work with these people, artists, to really critically grapple with these technologies and to really think about what they're capable of achieving or allowing us to achieve. And it was very interesting, because we started off thinking that they'd probably talk to us about how to present these things, but in fact, the interactions we had with the artistic community on the site cut back and back and back until we were talking about the absolute fundamentals of research practice. What does, for example, the notion of practice as research, which is something that's increasingly big with funding bodies across Europe, and what does that actually mean? And they introduced us to this idea that by making, in making, you actually constructed knowledge and you constructed understandings in new ways. We saw the value of this, and then gave these artists a hand in actually training the undergraduate students to think about what they were doing in a far more critical way. And I think really improved the quality of documentation on the site as well, which was fantastic. And then we spun that off, and this is one example of that. So these were magazines, so zines inspired by the punk rock zines of the 1970s, 80s, 90s, continuing on different subjects, but inspired by the Civil War pamphlets which were produced in the first era of mechanical printing in the UK. So it's a really fascinating counterpoint that was identified by the artists. You know, this was the first point at which people were producing highly personal accounts and then just throwing them out there and hoping people read them. And so we got some brilliant and quite weird interpretations of the project from these, and really got to quite a lot of the even underlying politics of the period of archaeology that we were excavating, really rising back up to the surface, and people's understandings of what it meant to be a reactionary, a revolutionary, and the tensions between Catholic and Protestant Europe and what they mean in Britain, which obviously is an extremely tense relationship at times. And so we had some really great conversations as a result of this, and these might not have been the things that would have come out of a standard archaeological methodology, and it created a great educational experience, and also I think inspired a lot of new research directions amongst our collaborators, which was great. maps and just some photographs. And then finally, how much time do I have? I don't know.
About another 5 minutes.
Oh, perfect. There we are. So, third project in the last third of the presentation, so that's great. So the last project I want to talk about today, which perhaps is the one that has the most resonance with the kind of things that we've been talking about today, and I have to say it's been really stimulating to hear all of the things you've been saying as this project develops. It's just fascinating to see all of the things that have concerned you and that you're excited about, and to think about how that reflects what we've been doing. And I hope there's sort of some room for collaboration here, really, because I didn't realise how much we did have in common today. But we've been working with Winchester School of Art, which is part of the University of Southampton, Central St Martin's College of Art and Design in London, and also Brighton University's School of Art, to develop some of the themes which came out of the Bayesian House project, which are how can the interplay between artistic practice, artistic forms of practice, and specifically fine art theory, and archaeological practice, how can these forms of practice influence each other? What's the interplay, what are the tensions, and what can they actually allow us to do in terms of developing our own way of documenting, recording, and thinking about archaeological sites and archaeology, but also how can they inform the way in which we reuse data and challenge our preconceptions about the kinds of people who are going to actually want access to archaeological data once a project is completed. This is only one highly specific community, but actually it helped us a great deal in thinking about different settings in which the data we produce might be reused and what the demands of that community might be. And this was one really fantastic example. We went down to a tower block in London, which was on the verge of being demolished and completely renovated, and we conducted a very brief one-day archaeological survey of certain rooms. And these rooms were very odd places because they were on the lower floor of a tower block, and there's this big, well, a very common trend in the UK, I don't know if it's the same in other countries, I suspect it probably is. When we built these big tower blocks in the 1960s, there was always a parade of shops underneath. And sometimes these shops were used, but more often they didn't really get used as much as they could have done. And so some of these were just boarded up and never opened again. So you had these very strange places which had been uninhabited for about 30 years, apart from people who broke in there and used them for various activities. And we documented some of these spaces, and then, but the documentation more often than not failed because it was such an unusual environment. And this is an example of some photogrammetry which was done of a room which was reappropriated despite being considered by us to be a reject by artists who turned it into a sort of Icelandic looking landscape. That's in fact a burnt wall with a white handprint on where the soot had been on the wall and someone's put their hand on. And it went wrong, but had use for somebody else. So it just goes to show you never know what's going to be useful to someone else. And as we're thinking about sustainability of our data, and as we're thinking about engaging with communities, I think it really goes to highlight, and this is why one of the reasons for me it was so refreshing to hear all these conversations today, the importance of listening to different communities and actually responding to them, and perhaps thinking about how we do things slightly differently. And these are just some other examples of visualizations and practice which we experienced as part of this project. So at the top there you can see lots of us having been instructed in screen printing as part of a workshop at Winchester School of Art. We were all invited to bring along digital images that we produced as part of our digital heritage, digital archaeology research, and to reproduce them using analog technologies, and to think about the conventions that we used and to think about challenging those conventions. And it was really, really successful. And underneath that we have a slightly simplified version of this, which was a screen printing workshop that we held for young school-age participants in the Basing House project to encourage them to create images of things they'd seen. And then, yeah, I won't go through them all exhaustively, actually, I'll leave it there, because otherwise we're going to start running late. But yeah, thank you all for listening.
Right, thanks very much, Gareth. We'll move on to our final speaker. It's a great pleasure to introduce Lorna Richardson from Lorna's completed a PhD at University College London on the impact of internet technologies on archaeology, and so very appropriate to end this session. And Lorna is also one of the key people who was involved in setting up the Day of Archaeology, and so we're very grateful for letting NEARCH then turn this into a European Day of Archaeology, hopefully, as well as develop that project.
I'm Lorna, and I'm going to go over some brief stuff that I'm going to read off my phone because my laptop was broken, and I hope it will make sense. But what I want to try and talk about initially is some of the outcomes of my own PhD research into the impact of digital technologies in the UK. I spent my research took place within the realms of commercial archaeology, community archaeology, archaeology that was done by community groups through HLF projects and so on, and university-based archaeology. And I took an approach of using a lot of online surveys and interviews, so it was very much a discussion of how people were feeling about the impact of technologies over the period from 2010 to 2013. I want to talk a bit about the importance of leveraging digital technologies in terms of what we're facing in the UK, certainly in terms of austerity and the impact of budgetary restrictions on archaeology, and why public engagement is a really important thing for us to be doing, and not least for the survival of us as a discipline. And if I can just find my paper, I'll crack on. There's been extensive research into the phenomena of what's been variously termed social media, social network technologies and so on. Understanding how these work and estimating the peer effects of online social influence are critical to understanding the impact of these technologies, social media, on public engagement with archaeology, and the potential for exploiting social networking for archaeological publishing, public engagement, fundraising, and very importantly, heritage activism needs to be thought out. Howard Rheingold popularised the term virtual community in the early 90s, and he defined online community as social aggregations that emerge when the net provides enough people to carry on discussions long enough with sufficient human feeling to form webs of personal relationships in cyberspace. We've moved on slightly from the word cyberspace, but it's still practical. The dominance of social media technologies on the internet has located these virtual communities around platforms such as Facebook and Twitter or Instagram, although the situation and definition of any online community is constantly evolving. Belonging to a number of these online communities is becoming a normal practice amongst internet users, yet much of the academic analysis of these online communities and networks takes place away in isolation from the community itself, and abstracts the community ties that people also hold offline with their online networks and interactions that take place offline. The internet is not a separate reality, and there is a close relationship between virtual and real communities. Digital communities grow from communities that have specific and localised values, problems, and identity. For most people, the relationships performed through internet technologies complement and enhance most real-life relationships in the real world, rather than replace them completely. These networks, rather than communities in the traditional sense of the word, are most people's current experiences of social relationships in real life, and modern communities are defined relationally, not spatially. The shift from group-based to individualised societies is accompanied by the emergence of flexible or social weak-tie networks. And I just want to go through a couple of these, which may sound a bit abstract and sociological, but bear with me, it will make sense. The emerging alternative model that we can call the logic of connective action applies increasingly to life in modern societies in which formal organisations are losing their grip and group ties are being replaced by large-scale fluid social networks. These networks can operate through the organisational processes of social media, and their logic does not require strong organisational control or the symbolic construction of a united we. Online community as a communal space outside and independent from institutions can also foster dissent, cultivate new discussions, challenge identity, reconfigure social relationships and cross hierarchies. However, the very structure of some social networking platforms and discussion fora can act as walls, hallways and doors with electronic locks, providing rules about who can participate and who can't, and who is excluded. Rules for communication, what acceptable conventions may or may not exist for newbies, for example, as well as social control agents and their practitioners within the communities in question. A lot of people have written that despite the promises of social media to embrace nostalgia for the lost communities of the past, there are historical precedents for the failure of every new form of communication to fill the utopian ideals for which always accompany their first appearance, and I don't think this is any different in the case of social media being the magic bullet for public engagement in archaeology. The iterative process of development and support for online communities in archaeology, as elsewhere, will require long-term commitment to sustain communication and the encouragement of social interaction, as well as maintaining the relevance of both discussion and platform. The sustainability of these online communities is a complex issue, involving technological and fashionable obsolescence, user unfriendly complex sign-up processes, active exclusion and clique behaviour, and the need to foster and support ongoing online dialogue. The concept of social capital, I just want to cover briefly, is defined as the benefits and resources accumulated through social networks and social relationships, famously associated with two academics, French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu and American political scientist Robert Putnam. Bourdieu's work on social capital focused on the benefits accrued by the individual by deliberately investing, constructing and participating in social networks and groups as the reproduction and encouragement of inequalities and elitism. He later goes on to define social capital as the sum of the resources, actual or virtual, that accrue to an individual or a group by virtue of possessing a durable network of more or less institutionalised relationships of mutual acquaintance and recognition. Putnam's work on social capital concentrates on those elements of activity and relationships in society that can encourage togetherness and cohesion. He defines this as bonding capital, so that's strong social ties with people like your neighbours, and bridging capital, where members of one group connect with members of other groups for advice, support or information, so a very, very sort of fluid and not particularly well invested relationship. The concept of weak ties is further defined as a form of social capital, this is bridging social capital, and they're not part of a regular post-social network. Relationships based on infrequent contact and an absence of intimacy and reciprocity. The weak tie relationship can provide great sources of information, professional connections, and organisational networking. It's structured so that a wide variety of information can be diffused and accessed through these different social networks. They might actually be advantageous for fostering online community. The flexibility of these relationships allow for experimentation and pose fewer concerns regarding social conformity. Diffusion research and communication studies, for example, has demonstrated that people rarely act on information received by mass media, but instead this needs to be reinforced by personal relationships, emphasising the importance of weak ties and bridging social capital to reinforce cohesion and collective action. So just moving on to drawing my argument to a conclusion, really, about the importance of these things. Online community formation is a key issue for archaeology, certainly during a period of unprecedented threat to the public funding of heritage organisations. There's huge potential for heritage organisations to exploit these weak ties and concepts of social capital to leverage the interest of archaeological communities online and the associated benefits of crowdsourcing, of volunteerism and so on and so forth. The gradual move towards this volunteerism will support the heritage sector, and interaction through social media engenders a sense of affinity with the subject at hand, supports these weak-tie relationships, develop into trusted and reliable online contacts, be that through something like a protest group or sharing of an archaeological news item. The data from my thesis itself demonstrates that self-identifying as belonging to these online archaeological communities creates a sense of group intimacy and shared purpose, which is something that all organisations really want to grasp very hard in terms of public engagement. And these networks develop a sense of mutual obligation and support, both online and offline. So whether these archaeological communities are located on Twitter or created through crowdsourced projects, or developed and dispersed through the actions of digital activism, the affinity with the subject of archaeology is a cement that bonds, perhaps only for a moment, but is a moment that lingers. This brief encounter with a sense of community in an archaeological context is an encounter with the past, a fleeting experience of awareness of the importance of this shared interest, and the ties that are created through this collective understanding of a shared fascination and a shared experience. I will ignore that. Before I start talking about the day of archaeology, these are the conclusions that came out of my PhD research. Why what I've just been talking about is important, and how we can leverage this joining together and this collective community benefit, and what we need to do. So we're talking a lot today about we're going to set up a Facebook group, we're going to create a project that will magically transform our communications online into something that has a meaningful and long, sustainable outcome. And the biggest problem that faces public archaeology as it's practiced online in the UK, obviously, is financial resources. Most organisations that are practicing public archaeology or public dissemination or engagement do not have budgets specifically for digital engagement, underestimating how much time and how much staff time and energy it takes to set up these projects and to maintain meaningful dialogue has been consistently underestimated by all the organisations I interviewed. None, I think out of 146 people, organisations I interviewed, 8 had undertaken any kind of audience research prior to creating and establishing digital projects. They were throwing some substantial figures of money at digital projects, some of them up to £10,000. Now, when you consider that without understanding who your audience could be, that you're spending or willing to spend blindly that amount of money, the argument for sustainability becomes lessened. Organisational attitudes towards public engagement online have been quite interesting to see. The growth of social media as a sociological concept is something that's culturally happened over the last 10 years, I suppose now. Archaeological organisations, certainly in the UK, have seemed quite resilient to this, certainly within the commercial sector, that it was seen as something that was ephemeral, it wasn't important to undertake. I think that's changing slightly as people are seeing that these media are not going away, but these can be effective platforms for discussion. In the UK, things are getting better in terms of access to broadband and mobile broadband. Certainly when you're talking about creating mobile phone applications or any kind of ranging heritage interpretation, then organisations are not thinking about the possibilities of people being excluded purely by the fact that they cannot pick up a mobile signal. Training for staff and training for participants are key things to bear in mind. Not everybody is able to use these technologies with any literacy. Digital literacy is a huge problem, both within professions and within society itself. Understanding how to use the internet, understanding how to access reliable information about archaeology and how to discern dodgy information is something that surprisingly few people seem to realise about looking at what key things you need to look for. In terms of training for creation and maintenance of these things, that is also an area that really does need some kind of consideration for it to become sustainable. Publicity and marketing is also difficult. A lot of organisations create digital projects, and they have done in the UK, and expected people to arrive there from Google. If you don't let people know that you have a digital project, then this is not going to be found magically through psychic powers. Policies for social media use. Social media is inherently a discussion, depending on the platform, obviously. you're communicating with real people, and that requires some organisational flexibility about the messages that you're happy to send out and that you're happy to share and discuss. A lot of social media policy in the UK controls discussion, and certainly a large sector, for instance, in the heritage, historic environment records in local authorities, they cannot use these media, so they cannot have these discussions simply because they are essentially part of government, and they're prevented from using these things. So thinking about appropriate policy to manage your social media use within your organisation, what kind of messages you want to bring, and what would happen in worst case scenarios. I mean, bad things do happen online. The best practice I've seen has been an emergency plan. What if somebody starts asking really difficult questions or has found information that you don't want to leak to the public? So thinking about that. Just a final comment that there isn't really a national or international focus for finding out where these websites, these different platforms are. So, people are having to use Google, or they're having to look at your publicity leakers. But thinking about how you can draw useful resources together in one place, and certainly with your website would be a useful place to start if you're thinking about just creating one place, a one-stop shop, a jumping off platform for people to find out more. I've stopped ranting now and I'll move on to the nice things. The Day of Archaeology project. So I don't know how much everybody knows about the project. The Day of Archaeology has been running now for 4 years, and it was a project that came out of a Twitter discussion between myself and Matt Law, who's a colleague who works at the University of Bath Spa University down in Somerset. We were inspired by something called the Day of Digital Humanities. I studied at the Centre for Digital Humanities at UCL. It's a very new concept within humanities, and so they have a day each year where people discuss what is a digital humanist and what do they do, and we thought, well, why are we not doing this for archaeology? There was at the time in 2011 no real sense of any window into what archaeologists do, apart from in the UK certainly Time Team and slightly strange windows into what archaeology could be, but actually the reality wasn't, we don't do things in 3 days, and not everybody does geophysics, which seems to be the trope. At the moment, the project is completely run for free. None of us are paid for our work. We have a team, we operate as a cooperative. We have done from the beginning. We have anywhere between 2 to 10 people working on the project. And these are drawn from a wide variety of organisations, some of them are PhD students. We have free hosting through the British Museum at the moment, purely because one of my colleagues is the Portable Antiquities Scheme ICT advisor, so he managed to shove us on his server out of the way. We have contacts at Brown University, and we've been working with the ADS for 2 years now. It works on a WordPress platform, so the whole site, so that there is, you see there, that's WordPress, and it's a sort of semi-customized theme. We provide people with logins to the WordPress, to the content management system, and they can upload their Day of Archaeology directly. So what we ask participants to do is write about their lives as archaeologists. What do you do? And we're looking for contributions from everybody. So we don't define what we believe archaeology to be, which can lead to some very broad and interesting interpretations of archaeology. But we have people represented from the museum sector, we have metal detectorists, we have science people doing archaeology of science, we have people doing very esoteric analysis of flint work. So we have, pretty much everybody and everything. In terms of our geographical spread, I don't know if we go on into that. In terms of our geographical spread, we've pretty much hit every continent apart from Antarctica, and we really do need to try harder in Asia. This past year, one of our colleagues now is based in Madrid. He's Spanish, so we were able to get more translations and more Spanish language contributions. Where possible, we ask people to contribute in their first language if they choose so, and we try and translate the work. It's very difficult. Obviously, we're all doing this for free, so time. We all have to take a day off each year, which is usually on the 29th of July in each year. And so this year we've done quite well in terms of Spanish language, but not so well in everybody else. We send out flyers to people. We ask anybody that works, studies, or volunteers in archaeology to assist. We have the website itself, so that's the central point, and we also have quite a heavy use of social media platforms as well, running alongside that. So we have a Facebook page where we reflect what's on the website and update there. We have a Twitter account, which this is a visualization of the 2013 discussions that took place on the Day of Archaeology. From the Day of Archaeology, you can see I'm making most of the noise, but just goes to show the amount of people that were talking about the project on the day. Unfortunately, this also shows that quite a lot of the people that were talking about the Day of Archaeology and the day were archaeologists rather than being members of the public, but that's another matter. Just as an illustration of some of the fun you can have with the Day of Archaeology, we have something called Archive Lottery, which is a project that's been run by the London Archaeological Archive and Resource Centre, which is the Greater London Archive for all archaeological collections from the Greater London area. And they have been using the Day of Archaeology website to run Archive Bingo. And so if you tweet to them on the Day of Archaeology any random number, they will run to their stores, pull out a box, take a photograph of the material found inside, and share it with you through the website. So it can be absolutely brilliant, or it can be a piece of very boring pottery, but it's great because they're opening their collections up to the public. And we have had lots and lots of support for this. It's worked really, really well. Last year we tried a new thing, which was live streaming from excavations. My colleague in Spain managed two sites in Spain. And obviously there were some technical issues, but this is something we would like to move towards, because I think that the creative opportunities that are there in terms of using this Day of Archaeology as a focus for one day, we could, if it's coordinated better and coordinated properly, we could be live from X site and moving on to a different part of the country, a different part of the country, a different part of Europe, wherever. One of the outcomes that I'm very pleased with was the massive open online course that was taught, or has been taught twice now at Brown, Archaeology's Dirty Secrets, was based on the material that was produced by the Day of Archaeology project. So it's had a big impact in terms of the numbers of people who are not archaeologists that have got involved specifically through this project, through the MOOC. It's amazing. There were something like 11,000 people each time accessing this. All of the material, all of the photographs, all of the videos that are available on the Day of Archaeology website are CC licensed, so anybody can reuse them, repurpose them, except obviously there's something we don't want to happen, but most of the material, 99% of the material is free for shared use. So looking towards the future, as I said before, one of the issues was the concept of social media discussions on social media discussions of stuff on the internet being ephemeral, and these things don't matter, but actually one of the reasons we wanted to set up the Day of Archaeology was to act as a document, a testament of what was happening in archaeology at this particularly interesting period of, practically the absolute collapse of our funding support for our discipline in the UK, certainly. And this is history in the making, except it's not written down in people's journals anymore. It's not a diary. It's not going to be a site record. This is online. It's a ephemeral, electronically processed media. And we're working with the ADS to archive the Day of Archaeology in the future, and I might be able to tell you a bit more about that if you're interested. Why does it matter, and why is it really important that we can work together to move this forward and grow it. I think this has an enormous amount of potential, certainly from listening to the work that you've been doing today. There are so many ways we could work together on this. It really does answer the question, what do archaeologists do? This is an opportunity for a real window into our discipline and demonstrates the inclusivity of what we do. It offers a very easy step into becoming digital, doing digital work. If people are not able to navigate WordPress, then we're quite happy to receive emails or Word documents and so on, and we'll upload it for them. So it's an easy step for people to take into the world of digital public archaeology if they're sort of scared of the technologies. And also there are huge opportunities for using creative media. So things like Colleen was talking about earlier, using that within the context of the Day of Archaeology has a huge amount of potential. That's me done in terms of the Day of Archaeology. This is my email address, and you can find me on Twitter. So if anybody has any questions later, please do ask. But I really hope that we can do something with this in the future.
Thanks very much. Well, I think we have sort of about 15 minutes for questions and discussion, so maybe you want to stay there and maybe the other speakers come back to the front as well.
Just before the question, to say that it's really a great opportunity for us to have this kind of state-of-art of digital archaeology. And thank you very much all to have provided us with such high-level presentations. I have a lot of questions, of course. You can start if you want one. Yeah. I want you to come back on Internet Archaeology. And I have two questions. The first one is, did you make a comparison in between human resources and maybe monies needed for such a project in a project more classical and in a paper written?
Yeah, I haven't done any formal analysis, but certainly it takes an awful lot longer to develop those integrated resources and the linking through to ADS resources, because obviously we're talking about a dynamic query that's being passed from the Internet Archaeology site through to an ADS record, which is great because we actually share the same infrastructure and the same server. But what we have done is actually we actually also have been linking through to the Portable Antiquity Scheme records, and actually that was actually quite easy to do. In terms of time, it was actually quite quick because the data structure was obvious. It was easy to pass those queries to and from. So it actually wasn't as much work as I thought dealing with a third party, with an external website, but it still takes quite a lot of time to develop and to consider and think about what queries you're actually having to ask in the first place before you actually implement the work. But traditionally, basic text and image articles are pretty quick to process. Obviously, there's peer review and everything else that goes on behind the scenes as well. But in terms of digitally presenting that's fine. But there's a lot of work behind the scenes in developing the web comment system, for example, as well.
Thank you. My second question, again on this publishing Internet Archaeology. Of course, it's a very great experiment, and we have to see, not as an example, but to see what is working there and what is not working, of course. That is why I have a question, and because this was one of the main objectives in our project, specifically on this, is do you have some feedbacks on the way that publishing in your digital publication, with all these media possibilities, is influencing the way the researchers are creating knowledge or content?
It's starting to, but it's taken 17 years really to get to this point. And actually there's still a lot of input. I find still quite a lot of input and suggestions are coming from myself to suggest ways for authors that they could enhance which route to take and what else actually might work for their data or for their particular project. So it's definitely still a conversation between myself and the author. But things are slowly starting to change. But in terms of how readers react with stuff, that's an analysis that we've never been able to undertake. We have lots and lots of access paths, but we just don't have time to actually analyse how that audience is accessing our digital output. So that's a really interesting area to explore, but it's possibly outside this particular project. But I mean, that's another, to take us to the next step. But in terms of what authors produce, yeah, it's still actually quite traditional most of the time, but it's slowly changing.
It's for you. I think you lifted so many good questions in presentations. Since we have in NEARCH, we are trying to bring together art and archaeology, and I see a kind of problem maybe when we are going to make publications. Because if you ask an artist to write an article, you will not have, the ASCII system for how to publish this. Maybe it's going to be a problem. I can see that how to make good publications. I can see it's going to be some tricky questions here, and we are told all the time you have to publish in that, you have to publish in that because it's high rank, it gives you more points. And then you are stuck with a very formal system. And if you're then bringing in artists, you're bringing in other people who are not in this kind of scientific frameworks. You have
yes, you have to change the box.
You have to change the box. That's right. So that's very good to have discussions, presentations like you did here with other possibilities, putting in video films, for example.
Yeah, I mean, it does raise the question: what's a publication? The need in this, compared to 20 years ago, what's a publication? But also the interesting thing is that recently, I forgot the name of mine, the last research
RAE.
The RAE, sorry, yes, the research assessment exercise here in the UK. Where scholars within academic departments have to put forward so many publications that then get assessed. And actually, Internet Archaeology's, in the last RAE, Internet Archaeology's publications actually, it's not the ref, I'm putting in the ref, I forgot the name.
Research assessment actually.
We are counted in that. Sorry, I was thinking about something else. It's the Thomson Reuters. It's the impact factor.
The impact.
And they actually will not accept inter-archaeology publications. Impact factors don't necessarily have a very strong presence in archaeology in the UK, but they won't accept inter-archaeology publications because we don't provide everything in a PDF. We can't actually provide everything in a PDF. Like you see that Guild Chapel model with the beautiful sort of multi-interpretation, but that's not. That's they have to catch up with us in some ways rather than the other way around. So yeah, it's a really interesting time, and I think things are starting to change.
Yeah,
I have numerous questions. Should I just fire them all away at once?
Just slow.
One at a time?
Yes, one or two.
Okay. Julian, I was hoping you could give a little bit more insight because I was fascinated by your last slide. Investment, research into investment for every pound.
Oh, yeah, the economic
return. Exactly. Could you give a little bit more insight on what basis that sort of return is calculated? What kind of things that we could think about?
Yeah, very briefly. There is, if you're interested, I talk later, but there's the full report is available on our website.
Sort of an idea.
Yeah, it's a number of different ways of measuring economic impact. It's a methodology that they developed originally with the sort of traditional museums world and then developed for digital archives. But it's comparing the cost of providing the service and the cost of depositing an archive with the economic gains. And the economic gains are measured in a number of ways. Some of them sort of quite obviously, like the cost that it would take if the report wasn't available online, but you needed it for your work, so you had to get the train and pay for that fare to go there. But it's also measured in terms of what you would be prepared to pay for something, so it's sort of done by a survey. But in fact, what they found is a more useful measure, particularly in archaeology, because we're a poor community, and when we're asked what would you be prepared to pay for something, we often say very little. So the measure that they use, which is an interesting one, is what would you want to be given, what cash would you want to be given if you had to give up that service to compensate you for it, if you see what I mean, which is an interesting, different economic measure.
And just as a follow-up to that, do you find that offers a certain political weight? I mean, in a time where things are expected to be exponential?
It has its sort of, I mean, that survey has been widely reported, for example, by one of the research councils that has provided funding to ADS in the UK, and in an impact study which they sent to government ministers and so forth, and key opinion formers. So I think it is important. We were saying earlier that often the heritage area doesn't measure its impact in economic terms. We're quite good on the social impact, but we don't necessarily measure it in economic terms. I think we should get better at it. It's obviously times of austerity as well. Funding is short, you need to justify money that's
Yes, we have to publish the report.
Yeah, the report is published on our website.
You have to show that to our boss.
Do I still get a second one?
Yes, of course.
It's for you, Lorna, and perhaps Colleen as well. You mentioned in your presentation some of the things, concerns and things to think about policies on these kind of social media, specifically, or at least how you mentioned it on the Creative Commons license. But I'm thinking also when these social medias are being implicated and basically a network is being expanded, a network of knowledge, that knowledge can be used, and that's what we're all thinking, for good things, building stronger community social capital, like you said. But at the same time, it obviously also is information that could be utilized and what we would see as being misused. Could you maybe shed a little bit more light on how the archaeological community and these kind of initiatives are very aware of that, or actually already implementing and devising policies to be one step ahead of this process?
Do you want to start or shall I?
Well, I'm just in terms of looking at something like the Portable Antiquity Scheme, where the information that's available online for their find spots are only given a very short number of location coordinates, so you would not be able to go on there and use that particularly well as a way of finding out where there's likely to be archaeology if you were interested in metal detecting on specific sites. I don't see particularly a huge amount of concern about that within the UK.
Yeah, that's the UK. It's definitely a more international perspective that is difficult, especially there's some databases that are being developed. Mercator, I believe, is one. It's sort of a US-Australia database that does mask some information, and you have to actually log in with certain credentials because some of the find spots are sacred or have sacred knowledge attached to them, and very often you can't have the same kind of grade literature available in the United States because it's actually illegal. It would be illegal for me to share, and that is something when you're out there with your phone and you take a picture and it gives you a GPS spot, you can get fired. You can get a lot of trouble for that. But I think in regard to the first part of your question, and intentionally speaking really loudly because it helps to be the loudest voice in the room. You have to really go after people and engage with them and say, I always get feedback from when I have this long post about pseudo-archaeology, the Bosnian pyramids that are definitely geological. And they actually destroyed a lot of the sites on top of these pyramids to prove that they are pyramids, they're not pyramids. And so I definitely get some people coming back at me for that, or for other sort of sacred geometries and things. But you engage as much as you can. Use your professionalism, use your knowledge. You are a stakeholder in this. You do have specialist knowledge. And if you can't, then alert somebody that you know. Like Rosemary Joyce has kind of gone after when the gay Neanderthal caveman story came out, she debunked a lot of it. And she's quite prominent archaeologist, and so I think that's the best you can do. Really make yourself available make sure there's an intelligent viewpoint, and provide your expert knowledge.
I have one. I want to come back to something with you, Lorna, and it's a little bit linked with the comment Kostas made on the way with the Swedish experience on give the voice to everybody in a sense, and we will see what is getting out of here. It's your heritage, and you are right to interpret it and disseminate a little bit what you think is your heritage. And it's also in the project, but also we want to discuss a little bit of this. I think it's not completely straightforward. And my question is, beyond the commercial opportunities of these networks, I put that a little bit aside. The models you were showing us and the analysis you made, quite deep inside these networks, and what you call communities, for me, questioning very clearly the relationship of our sector with the state. And it looks like we are we have another view of the future where the responsibility in terms of funding, maybe in terms of quality control, and there could be a little bit more challenging, is slipping from the state to something else. And you are telling us that maybe this space of social networks or social communities out there are one of these spaces. For us, very central state, very strong state, this is something quite frightening. Looks like in UK, this is clearly on the way. Am I right? Or?
I think we're in a very interesting time, definitely, in terms of what's going to happen next. You know, we're looking at massive 4.2 billion budget cuts predicted for our local government. So the impact of that on any planning oversight is going to be absolutely dangerous. You know, the archaeology planning conservation is low-hanging fruit in terms of saving money. So yeah, we are walking towards disaster, and that seems to be cross-party. So whatever, because we're coming up to an election in May, whatever happens, there are no commitments from government, local alternative parties to any kinds of funding support for archaeology. And we certainly haven't done ourselves any favours in terms of promoting ourselves and the reasons why we're an important part of society and culture. So yeah, I mean, it's a frightening future. I'm not arguing necessarily that the volunteerism, you know, that this is the step forward that we should be making. You know, in my personal opinion, is something completely different. But you know, this provides an opportunity for that to happen. This is a rhetoric within government at the moment in the UK of a big society, that communities step in, that you know, that it's natural for volunteers to want to support these, you know, devalued industries that, you know, professionals are sidelined because it's cheaper to have one person managing a team of volunteers than it is to have professionals managing information. So I'm veering into ranting, but yes, it's a frightening prospect. In terms of what digital technologies can bring to that is, I think, you know, we need to look at that as a platform for public engagement about why we're important, about how you can become part of protests against these budget cuts. You know, we need to use this. These are the streets of 1968 now. You know, we need to be protesting. You know, yeah, leverage it. We need to leverage these things.
If I may, we still need the infrastructure for volunteerism to work and to be at all effective. It still needs the professional infrastructure to support it and make sure it develops in appropriate ways. And we're seeing a situation where there won't even be that level of minimal support to facilitate volunteering after the next election.
But I'm sure you have an idea of what all this is meaning in terms of our own practices and position in society. It's quite. I can imagine that for France, for Greece, for Italy.
Yes. It's this program for many years.
And we are entering in a very interesting, as you said, also very quite frightening zone.
Yeah. We've just, in the UK, the day before yesterday was that the Institute for Archaeologists became a chartered institute, so we're suddenly sort of raising ourselves in terms of our professional standing in society's eyes, yet at the same time the rug is being pulled from under our feet, so they're very interesting times.
I could add to that very slightly and say something maybe slightly more optimistic, which is that I think the digital technology does also have the potential to allow us, I think you probably agree with this, allow us to empower volunteers to do better research. So I think this is something, at least, that with the limited resources we do have available, it's possible, as in the case of the church recording project we were working on, to enable researchers who are probably sort of producing what would be substandard research by professional standards, and raise that to the point where the data is actually reusable by other people then. So that's positive, and I think a project like this could actually have an enormous impact in that area. I think that's really exciting. But
This is positive.
yeah.
Thank you very much.
Shall I say a word about what happens now? We need to leave King's Manor in 5 minutes to go to Jorvik, where we're going to be met by some Vikings, and we are going to be processing around Jorvik. More will emerge what's going to happen later, but we'd encourage you, not really time to go back to your hotel and then to go to Jorvik. If you've got any bags that you don't need tonight, we can lock them in my office. If you've got laptops and so forth that you don't need later, you can leave here. Or otherwise, we're not actually going to be walking very far. It's actually further to walk to the hotel than it is to Jorvik. Yeah.
If you go directly, you have a BMO.
Is there anything else to add?
Oh, I was just going to say that everyone who's just presented will be joining us for dinner tonight. So if you do have questions that are specific questions that you would like to ask, they'll all be available to you this evening as well.
I've got someone's black memory stick here as well, so I don't use it if you want to see it. And don't leave without this.
Thank you.
So we will leave them outside the Porter's Lodge at the front of King's Manor in 5 minutes.
Same slide.
I've only got a temporary stay about it myself. What is that? It's a torch. It's a Minecraft torch. Papercraft. So it's something. It's a geomorphic torch. It's now made analog. Analog is called analog.
Good luck. Do keep me posted. We've got a suite on our presentation. Any other? You can see